And in this section of the video, we are going to learn how to take the cube root of perfect cubes. So we looked at square roots of perfect squares. Now we're going to look at cube root of perfect cubes. And just like there are squares all around us, there are cubes around us as well. Cubes are really just three-dimensional squares. So just like there are perfect squares and square numbers, there are perfect cubes and cube numbers. So the essential question for this one, which you probably could have guessed, is if you were told the volume of a cube, how can you determine the side length? So if I told you that a cube could hold a certain amount of liquid or could hold a certain amount of gas, could you determine, or how can you determine, the length of the side of the cube? So first, let's discuss what is a perfect cube. If a number is a perfect cube, then you can find its exact cube root. So a perfect cube is any number that has an exact cube root. So just like there are perfect squares, you have perfect cubes. And a perfect cube is a number that can be written as the cube, which means raised to the third of another number. So if we had in review from the last lesson, we talked about square numbers. So 4 squared is 4 to the second power, which is 16. Well, if we used cubes, we would find that 4 cubed, which is 4 to the third power. If we had 4 to the third power, which is 4 cubed, we know that equals 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64. So 4 cubed is 64. By that same rationale, that same logic, if we had the cubed root, and it gets a little extra notation here, if we had the cubed root of 64, this is the same thing as saying the cube root of 4 times 4 times 4, which is just 4. So perfect cubes. This is 1 to the third power, which is 1 times 1 times 1, just equals 1. So 1 cubed equals 1. Therefore, the cubed root of 1 is just 1. The cube root, 2 cubed, or 2 to the third power, is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. So 2 cubed equals 8. 3 cubed, 3 times 3 times 3 is 27, so 3 cubed is 27. 4 to the third power, 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. So therefore, 4 cubed is 64. 5 times 5 times 5, or 5 cubed, is 125. So on and so forth. So now, how to find the cube root of a number. So you may not intuitively know that the cube root of 64 is 4. And if you didn't, that's okay. We can always go to a factor tree. So what goes into 64? Maybe you didn't start with 2. Maybe you just did 2 times some number equals 64. Well, 2 times 32 is 64. Well, if we keep going, 2 goes into this 16 times. And if we keep going, 2 goes into this 8 times. 2 goes into 8 4 times, and 2 goes into 4 twice. So 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 64. So what that little 3 tells us is that we're looking for things that appear 3 times. So if we were to put all this back together, and you look that you have a group of 2's, a group of 2's, and a group of 2's. So we have 3 groups of 2's. So really 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 2 is 4, and 2 times 2 is 4. So really what we have is 4 times 4 times 4, so we're looking for 3 of the same number, and we have 3 4s here, so the cube root of 64 can be written as just 4. Another example might be the cube root of negative 64. This is really the cube root of negative 1 times 64, which is really the same thing as negative 1 times the cube root of 64. Well, the cube root of negative 1 is just negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, so the cube root of negative 1 is negative 1, and we know from our previous example the cube root of 64 is 4, so therefore the cube root of negative 64, negative 1 times 4, just negative 4. Some more examples could be, we could write 27 as 3 cubed, because 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 times 3 is 27. Therefore, the cube root of 27 is 3. 216 could be written as 6 times 6 times 6, and the cubed root of 216 is 6. If we had a fraction, we know 64 is just 4 times 4 times 4. 25 is simply 5 times 5 times 5, or 4/5 cubed. The cube root of 64 over 125 is 4/5. So now let's look at a cube. So back to our essential question, if I told you the volume of a cube, could you tell me the length of one edge? So how could we do that? So let's say that we are given that the volume of this cube is, so if we go back to our essential question, if you were told the volume of a cube, how can you determine this? So let's say that we are given that the volume of this cube is 512 cubic centimeters. So that means all the space inside the cube. So if we wanted to fill this cube up with water, or we wanted to pack it full of luggage to go on a trip, whatever it is, if there were a box and we are shipping a gift to someone, all of the space inside is 512 cubic centimeters. But I need to determine what is the length of one side or one edge. Now we know that a cube means that all sides are congruent. So all of these sides are the same length. So they're the same all the way around. To find the volume of a cube, we do length times width times height. But since it's a cube, that means all of the sides are the same. So really what we're doing is side times side times side. And we know from our previous lesson that if you multiply the same thing times itself twice, you get side squared, which means that if you do the same thing times itself 3 times, you're really getting cubed. And we can write this using the variable s for side cubed. So if I find the volume of a cube, I do length times width times height. Since it's a cube, all of the dimensions are the same, so it's really side times side times side, or just s cubed. Now if I know the volume, because it's given to me, the volume is 512, I can substitute in 512 for v, because volume is v, and I know that the volume is the same as all of the sides multiplied together. Well, going back to what we know about equations, we undo equations by using inverse operations. The inverse of cubing a number is taking the cubed root so the cubed root of side cubed is just side. The cubed root of 512 is 8 times 8 times 8. And you can do a factor tree to figure this out, or you can use what you know about other perfect cubes and get a good estimate and then solve from there. So the cube root of 512 is 8. So if I were given the volume of a cube, using what I know about equations and cube roots, I could find the length of one side. So the length of one side of this cube is 8 centimeters. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Mr. Johnson's Math Class. See you soon.